I want to first get your sort of reasoning of why do you think the West provoked Russia? Why this argument?
Well, I believe that the principal cause of the Ukraine war is NATO expansion. To put it in more general terms, the West was determined to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. And the core element in that policy was NATO expansion. And in April 2008, at the Bucharest summit, the Bucharest NATO summit, the alliance said that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. The Russians made it unequivocally clear at the time that that was not going to happen. That Russia viewed Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat, and they would go to great lengths to prevent Ukraine from joining the alliance. So that raises the question, why did the United States and its European allies continue to push NATO eastward to bring Ukraine into the alliance when the Russians made it unequivocally clear that this was unacceptable to them? And the answer is that we thought we could shove NATO expansion down their throat and they would not fight us over the issue. You want to remember that the United States decides in the mid-1990s to expand NATO eastward, despite the fact that the United States had promised Gorbachev that there would be no NATO expansion. But anyway, the first tranche of expansion takes place in 1999 when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic come into the alliance. It's very important to understand that the Russians are terribly unhappy about this, and they make it clear to the Americans that they think the Americans have betrayed their promise to Gorbachev and that this is a threat to Russia. Then there's a second expansion, a second tranche.
Putin takes over in between.
Yes, in between, right. Putin takes over in 2000, right. The first tranche of NATO expansion is 1999. Putin takes over in 2000. And then in 2004, you have the second tranche of expansion when Putin is in the driver's seat. And of course, Putin screams bloody murder that this is not acceptable, that Russia does not want further NATO expansion, but nevertheless, we expand. Then in 2008, when NATO says at the Bucharest summit that there will be a third expansion, a third major expansion into Ukraine, the Russians say, that's not happening. We're drawing a red line in the sand this time, right? NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat. What does the United States and its European allies do? We continue to push for NATO expansion. We continue to try to bring Ukraine into NATO. A major crisis breaks out in February of 2014. This is when the Russians take Crimea and the civil war in the Donbass breaks out. And you would think at that point in time that the Americans might back off, that this is leading to serious trouble. But the Americans don't back off. The Americans continue to push for NATO expansion. And then in January 2021, President Biden moves into the White House. Remember, he's elected in November 2000. He moves into the White House in January 2021. Biden has a long-standing reputation as a Ukraine hawk. When he was the vice president under Obama, Obama assigned him the Ukraine portfolio. And he was in the administration. He was the vice president when the 2014 crisis broke out. And Biden is deeply committed to, if anything, getting tougher with the Russians on bringing Ukraine into NATO. And it's no accident that a year and a month, 13 months after Biden moves into the White House, the war breaks out. And the reason is that Biden is doubling down on bringing Ukraine into NATO after he moves into the White House. And even in late 2021, early 2022, when it looks like there's going to be a war in Ukraine, remember, the Americans were saying, we think there's going to be a war in Ukraine. Does the United States back off? No. Does the United States try to work out a diplomatic solution to the problem? No. The United States continues to push and push. In fact, on December 17th, 2021, remember the war breaks out February 24th, 2022. 2 months before that, December 17th, 2021, Putin writes a letter to Jens Stoltenberg, who's the head of NATO, and a letter to Joe Biden proposing a possible solution to putting an end to this crisis and preventing a major war. What does the United States do? The United States basically tells Biden, the United States basically tells Putin that it has no interest in working out some sort of diplomatic arrangement. If you go back and look at the diplomacy at the time, it's quite remarkable how little interest the United States had in solving the problem diplomatically. And it's because we thought we could push NATO expansion down the Russians' throat. And if that did not work and a war broke out, we thought we could defeat the Russians.
You know, there is a lot of support for this argument in India, in the constituency in India. But many would argue that this is, what you're saying is exactly what Putin's argument has been, that you're amplifying it. And it was Ukraine which decided on its own to turn towards the West. How do you counter that argument? You're not ascribing agency to Ukraine, which is an independent state?
Well, first of all, I am often accused of being Putin's puppet because I make the same argument that he and other Russian leaders make about the causes of the Ukraine war. I don't view myself as Putin's puppet. I'm not interested in defending Putin. What I've always been interested in are the facts and logic. And if you look at the facts and logic, what you see is that Putin's explanation for what caused this war is correct. And the story that we hear in the West about Putin being an imperialist who was bent on conquering Ukraine so he could incorporate it into a greater Russia is a myth that was made up in the West to justify what happened on February 24th, 2022. So I think it's just a matter of facts and logic. Now, what was your second question?
I was saying Ukraine's own agency towards
Yes.
leaning towards the West.
Yes.
It wants to be a democracy. It wants to be integrated into European Union, into NATO. Why deny them that agency?
Very simply, because if you try to bring Ukraine into NATO, you're going to end up destroying Ukraine. If we follow your logic, the end result will be what we see happening today. This is the argument that Ukraine is a sovereign state and it has the so-called right to join the alliance. It has the right to choose its own foreign policy. The problem with that argument is the Russians don't agree. The Russians don't think that Ukraine can just do whatever it wants because the Russians care about their own security. Great powers care about their own security. And if you're a smaller country and you live next door to a great power, you have to be very careful in terms of choosing your foreign policy. You have to be very careful that you don't do anything that provokes that great power to invade your country. And that tells you that Ukraine has to pay careful attention to what Russia wants.